The official title of this is, it's something like "Who cares?" It's why does this matter, right? So, and that's aimed at, two audiences: those of you who have an interest in the implications of all this information for ad valorem taxation, and probably a really smaller group, people outside that field who actually are curious about it. So, if anybody does want to leave now that you know the topic, you're cool. No offense here. But in that regard, and Jim certainly referenced some of this, but we want to think about the implications of what we talked about today, particularly the state of broadband fiber networks today, right? The current hybrid fiber coax networks, the implications of the move to fiber deep, and the implications of fiber to the premises as a standard for replacement cost. The first thing I would ask, and this is to those of you who are jurisdiction officials in here, how many of you have a policy or something in your rules or handbook that points to how one should consider replacement cost in your reviews for obsolescence? Okay? I'll give you some advice. Take a look, because I think it's in pretty much all of them. It just, in this industry, maybe, I think the thing is, maybe you don't hear it a lot, but it is, as referenced earlier, one of the most useful things. It's not to necessarily give you a valuation answer from just an RCNLD, but to provide information and evidence of how you might tackle the issue of what is the source of obsolescence and how much is it and how should it impact value. Carl, I'm going to ask you first question. We talked about replacement cost new as the standard, something that's going to be well in the replacement cost new of a fiber to the premises network being the basis for an RCN analysis that's applicable here. And I think we need to start with some thoughts on why that is the case and why that's most relevant for the purpose of this discussion. Make sense?
Yep. So I'll move around a little bit. It was getting a little warm over there with John on the fire. So, this does parlay off of Jim's discussion earlier today, and it did. Something else stemmed from last night from our discussion. If we extended it longer, we might have begun to talk about are we living in a simulation, right? So, which we could have a lot of debate about that, but I think really Jim likes living in a simulation because he likes creating these hypothetical systems that is not the path of fiber or whatever. But so I too found a Dilbert for Jim.
Does it have your name in it?
It kind of looks like Jim, right? So Jim, you get no respect because of you're always in your models. You're always in your video games of modeling things. Well, actually, say that in jest. It is the right way to go, even though it is a simulation or a hypothetical world that we live in terms of trying to measure value. That's essentially what you do when you're doing valuation. The challenges that we see out there is that when you start with historical cost, and then you take the promulgated tables, if you will, whether they're index tables, and then you apply the depreciation tables, and we hear it a lot. Hey, we're just following the guidelines, and when you just follow the guidelines, what you get is an assessed value that is much in excess of fair market value because the laws aren't keeping up, and the tables aren't changing rapidly enough in order to take into account what's going on. And so the true fair market value is really quite a bit less because you have to start with this hypothetical system, fiber to the prem in this case. So it's much more complex to simply apply schedules. It really is the industry's responsibility, I think, to help educate the jurisdictions about this. So what's causing it? Of course, we've heard it all week long, the past 2 days, I should say. Customer demand for broadband speeds, the technological advancements, both in computer hardware, software, methods, and standards. So, this is Nielsen's law. You've heard of Moore's law. This is Nielsen's law, where the requirements for broadband is increasing at 50% a year. But bandwidth is pretty much, if you think about and juxtapose that with Moore's law, which is the hardware and software progression, that's moving about 60% a year. So bandwidth is kind of the gating factor within using the internet. This is another graph I thought was interesting, but more the decision for cable companies to go to fiber deep is because of that growth, and this is a lot of crazy lines on this graph, but it's really the red line, right? So the red line is, hey, look, this is what capacity for demand for broadband capacity is moving at, and here is kind of what we call DOCSIS 3.0, DOCSIS 3.0, DOCSIS 3.1 here, and then what is also known as fiber deep. So essentially, you're going to bypass the capabilities of fiber deep in a short period of time of 2027. So you're going to, and we saw earlier within the year, all that money that's being spent is never going to get a return until much later. Well, by the time you're going to start getting a return, you're out of date, right? So it's the investments that are being made within the cable industry and in other broadband industries rapidly is obsolete. You're not increasing your revenues. You're just trying to keep your customers. So Jim stole some slides from me, so I stole some slides from him. So I won't go through them again. But this is essentially the steps in which we think about how to really start with what the assessor starts with, and then making the adjustments, ultimately getting down to the fair market value. But you have to account for a lot of different things. And I'll kind of pause there as we work through these answers.
John, so you see this, I've seen this before and had a chance to kind of walk through it and take a look. From Charter's perspective, how you stand today versus how you may have addressed these issues, both in communication to your management and to assessment officials, this approach looks different than you may have approached in the past, or pretty much the same?
Yeah, I mean, from where we are right now, with what we report and the CapEx that's being added, we're far on the left side of this. I mean, we're nowhere near the right side.
Yeah. And so my impression is with you, like with others, the CapEx are, and you may have a better term, are just stacking.
That's right.
So that's getting bigger, right?
That's right.
So the delta between that and what we're ultimately going to have to get to is market value. It's wider. It's less connected, right? If you look at original cost and you think of the relationships between original cost and a net value, they're different now. They're different. Any of the assumptions, I would have thought ratios in the past, you show me something, you deal in ratios, I'd say, oh, it should be between this and this. That's changing.
Right.
That's changing, right? So, I mean, for Charter Spectrum, how far along are you in deploying, and I'm assuming you are, a fiber deep architecture?
So with Charter Spectrum, because of the integration, so the acquisition merger was in May of 2016. The integration has taken the better part of 2 years, probably till year end 18. At year end 18, we only have deployed 9% of our plant as fiber. And most of that would not be considered to be fiber deep. It's more of getting fiber serving the nodes.
So you're really you're starting.
We're at the very beginning of it.
Have to ask, not on the panel, but obviously we need to know, is that the standard, just roughly Comcast, how far, you can answer it any way you want by years or whatever, how far, anybody here from Comcast, are you into deployment of fiber deep? You're just starting, you started, but it's very early on the curve. How would you characterize?
Sure. I would say we're still in the early stages. However, when we look at our plant mix, we do have substantially more than 9%. We're at about 25% of our total network is fiber. But as far as fiber deep served customers, there's still, I think, less than 5% of our total footprint is served by fiber deep.
Okay.
And that's with 25% fiber. So you see that you really have to ramp up the amount of fiber to cover your footprint in fiber.
Now, somebody may have mentioned this before, but I missed it, so maybe some of you did as well. And there might be one optimum, but anybody can answer this question. Ultimately, with deployment of fiber deep strategy, what do you think the stabilized point is as far as fiber as a percentage of the network plant or miles, however you would measure it?
It's probably going to approach probably 40 to 50%.
Okay.
Because you still have to have that coax run down the neighborhood streets.
Yes. Yeah.
So there still will be a lot of coax that's still in the system.
And John, Carl, from your perspective, how does that affect? How specifically does that affect the value of the remaining coax? It's going to be there, but it in essence performs a different role. Its position within the network is different. It's there for a different reason than it was. So I'm assuming that has implications, value. A, do you agree? B, how so? And this is to either or both of you.
I'll maybe take it first. So, when you're doing a evaluation, you're valuing the subject assets, right? So you're not valuing some hypothetical assets, even though we start with a replacement scenario that is, it may or may not look like what the plant looks like in the next near term. So what's clear is that making sure that when the question is asked as to what is the depreciation of coax, what's most importantly is what is the functionality of the coax that's in place, and then two, how long will that existing coax stay in place and be functional. And so the remaining useful life of the coax of the subject plant is extended because of the direction that Comcast is going, but it doesn't mean that the functionality is being extended. It's actually being shrunk, and it's maybe more used for different radio frequency broadbands to even more so just powering the network per se. So it's all about describing the functionality and the useful life of the subject plant. Now that, when you're valuing it, has to be compared to the replacement plant. So if the replacement plant is a pure fiber to the prem, right, now you've got your numerator or denominator, if you will, that number on the bottom of a present value calculation or a percent good calculation, that's going to be a longer life asset, right? So a fiber has longer life than coax. And so numerator is how long is this coax going to be there in place of the subject plant, divided by how long is that replacement plant life would be as if new, which is fiber as if new.
John,
Yep.
this type of information, the status, present and future status of your coax base, I mean, your reported cost in the category of plant or distribution or however various jurisdictions identify it, right now is 91% coax.
That's
Is my
right.
math good? Yep, okay. Are you preparing to provide perspective besides just cost to your assessment jurisdictions regarding the future status of fiber?
That's what we'll have to start doing, because as we extend the fiber and that percentage goes up and the coaxial percentage goes down, that remaining coaxial cable that has been out there for years and years may have been on a 10 to 12 year life table, but the remaining life of that coaxial cable will not be 10 to 12 years anymore.
Correct. And what's the implications for residual values then in your thinking? I mean, many jurisdiction tables without any adjustment for obsolescence may have an effective residual of up to, say, 20-25% for a plant or distribution category, unlike what they might have for cable electronics, which might be as low as 1% or 3%, right? So what are the implications for residuals?
I think
Yeah.
the residual value, we saw a graph, right? So in 2030, fiber deep is not going to be capable of supporting the broadband demand, right? So that's 11 years from now, right? So, but the implication is that there is no value to the coax at the end of that life, because it's no longer becomes useful because you need a fiber to the prem network. In fact, it is a detriment to the extent that you have to pull it off the poles, and many cases buried. You can leave it in the ground, but or if you need to make room in the conduit, then you have to pull it out of the conduit. So it becomes a negative salvage value as opposed to any value at all.
So as a practical matter, so you know, those of you again who are assessment officials or their consultants or agents here, you know, you've heard a lot that I think everybody would agree, hey, there's some things to be considered here. And information today is good. I'm not trying to put you on the spot at all, and you don't have to be that specific, but I think while we're all here, and one of the aims of the conference this year is to try to have more interaction between those responsible for making assessment values and those companies that are going to pay tax on them ultimately. And it's, you know, hearing this, what ideally, or whether you think is practically, would you like to see from taxpayers to assist you in evaluating the impact of this move toward fiber deep around provision of replacement cost information? There's so many ways information can be presented, and in my experience, very often it's a square peg, right? You know, somebody brings you X, hey, this is great, it makes sense, but it's not exactly what I need because of my rules, because of my procedures, whatever. I know people here from industry, consultants would certainly appreciate your perspective, and maybe that even bleeds over into the next session. But anybody, please, any comments, any advice on what you might want to see? Because if you don't, they'll just send you what they think is right, and it may make sense to you or may not. So thank you.
I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying, but how would you measure that functional obsolescence? I guess is
Right.
You know, how we would take the original cost as depreciation, and if we had some sort of documentation that documents your functional obsolescence, and we could apply that.
Then it should be, and I think industry people would agree with you. Thank you. That's a good answer. That I think we're thinking this should be presented around the appraisal concept and the standards relating of functional obsolescence. Correct, Carl?
Absolutely. And you know, that's the questions that you should be asking, right? So it's like, prove it to me that you are experiencing this obsolescence. And the approach that we tend to take is, well, here is our returns, and here's what has been filed that big number. The question is that the right starting point or not? In traditional circumstances, you'd trend it, and then that would be the right starting point, and then you depreciate it from there. But when we go through these models, like Jim has described, the fiber to the prem, there is a much lower cost if you were to build it today using the appropriate economic decision of fiber to the prem. It's dramatically different. And so the difference between that is excess capital cost, which is defined as being functional obsolescence. And so that's the first layer of functional obsolescence that's clear and can be proven by saying, here's what we filed, but here is essentially the replacement cost new of those assets. So instead of a positive trend, it's really a negative trend in many cases. And so that's the first thing we start with. And then if you extend the definition of functional obsolescence, it's not just the excess capital cost, it's also things like excess operating costs. So as you heard earlier, a fiber to the prem network has much lower cost to operate because you can do things remotely. It doesn't have all these amplifiers in the system anymore. It's all the power is even at the homeowners is driving the power with a battery pack. So it's there is a lot less operating cost within a pure fiber system. So how does that compare with the existing operating costs? So if you're an investor, you certainly don't want to pay as much as what you could do to replace it, right? So that's your first adjustment or haircut that you make. The second one is, hey, wait a minute, I don't want to own this asset and be burdened with excess operating costs, so I'm going to further discount my purchase price down to get more even parity or profitability with this other plant. So that's the two steps that we take. That one, excess capital costs using replacement cost new studies, and then two, excess operating costs. There are other things such as what we call lost profits, whereas a fiber to the prem system has a better customer experience, right? Why is it better? Well, it's faster. It gives me better services, and so I'm actually willing to pay more for that. It's higher broadband capacity. So with the fiber to the prem system, I get more revenue, but with this existing system, I don't have that ability to sell those additional revenues. So that's yet another quantification of obsolescence.
So I'm going to try to summarize what Carl just said.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. So, as a practical matter, and I think this leads into a good question or comment. The way I would think of it is, okay, if you're looking to, okay, somebody needs information to do their job, right? And first of all, if you're thinking functional obsolescence, as Carl's saying, the first thing I ask, what's the source of it, right? I got to know what the source is first, because if you just give me a calculation, I don't know where that comes from. So I would hope that some sort of summary of, all right, where's this come from, right? So we tell you where it comes from, right? Then next, based on where it comes from, how does one quantify that? Step two. Still with me? Everybody with me? That's where we go. Third, and this may be most important, all right, you quantify that, but then how is that adjustment made for functional obsolescence? And typically, we would think, I'm from Georgia, the Georgia rules are very clear that you do something called a basic cost approach, and that's just the statutory tables. A lot of people think that's the way you get to a value in Georgia. It's not. Read the rules. The rules say don't stop there. It says that's only a basic cost approach. It doesn't say that's an estimate of market value. To get the estimate of market value, the rules require two things, that you consider functional and external obsolescence to get a cost approach, right? So we're kind of assuming that presentation of the formula to quantify needs to conform with your state's rules or policies, right? It needs to fit. I think it's incumbent on the taxpayer not to give you an orange and an apple, right? That, here's where it comes from. Here's the formula to quantify. So, and here's the percentage, right? And ultimately, it has to be calculated where it should apply in your model, correct? Is that fair enough? Okay. Carl, there's a very clear formula or recommendation in the Georgia rules for cost approach functional obsolescence. And what does that say?
That's to compare the replacement cost new to the trended historical cost. And so take your filings, trend them, gives you one answer. Compare that to what is a proper replacement cost new, and if you divide the two, it'll give you a percent of obsolescence. So if your replacement cost new is 500 and your trended historical cost is 1,000, that's 50% of percent good of the adjustment that you should make, or one minus that would be the obsolescence.
And that's made to the basic cost approach number.
Yes.
Okay? This makes sense. I know, yes, please.
Are you saying that it's cheaper to lay fiber per mile than the coax? I mean, actually on a per mile basis?
Well, I think what we're describing is what is the replacement cost new as compared to the historical cost, right? So if you were to say, I'm going to build a brand new, what's out there today is hybrid fiber coax system, that's actually lower cost than a pure fiber network. Not much lower. I think Jim showed it was a couple percentage points lower.
If you did it all now, is the point.
Yeah, if you did it all now.
Remember that.
A hybrid fiber coax system is marginally less cost than a fiber to the prem system. But that's not what we're trying to compare. We're not trying to decide what is the right replacement. What we're trying to decide is our historical cost trended, or whatever you want to do to it, how does that compare with what is the true representation of the starting point today?
And that's been built over the years.
Wait, hold
with
it.
less
I'm-
efficient techniques,
I'm
with
getting
different,
more
so there's the
confused here,
distinction.
Because
Yeah.
I heard you say, I think, that the current, the RCN for building that network is slightly more than the historical cost of building the coax network.
So,
Correct, but let me make a point
No,
there.
no, no,
What
no.
you're saying is two. No, that's two
Hey,
RCNs.
Jeff,
You're-
let me
yeah,
correct
go
that,
ahead.
because that's not
Yeah.
what I said.
So I said,
Okay.
yeah.
I was comparing. I have two options. Let's say I have a clean slate, right? I get to decide whether I want to build a hybrid fiber coax that looks a lot like what's out there today, or do I build a pure fiber network? So the question there is, which one's more expensive? Well, pure fiber is more expensive. So that's the first answer. That I'm not saying there that the hybrid fiber coax system is historical cost, because remember, historical cost is accumulations of costs that have occurred over time, that they've capitalized all these truck rolls and replacements and repairs, and they don't clean the books up because it's taken care of in the depreciation, so that's financially sound in certain terms of financial reporting. But this is what you have to start with as an assessor, is kind of that historical cost. That is substantially higher than if you replace it with a hybrid fiber coax system today, or even if you compare it to a pure fiber network.
And how do you quantitatively measure that? I mean,
How do you determine the replacement cost new of a network today?
no, I understand how to do that. I'm
Okay.
just saying that when you laid the coax, you're saying that the cost of that was approximately what a new network would cost now. So I understand what you're saying about, okay, so they've been out and they've repaired it, but I guess that's not a capitalized cost.
No,
So-
it's not
So
only
what
repairs.
kind of cost are you talking about?
Think about this. They did it over time. When they started, it wasn't a hybrid fiber coax network, right? It was almost a pure coax network. And also, if you think about cost, it's true with a home or anything else, the construction techniques are much more efficient today, right? So even though unit labor costs may have been less, units of labor were more in those days. So when somebody strings together a network of costs where they built a little here, somebody built a little there were incumbent providers, these companies bought them, what they did was likely nowhere near as efficient as one could do today on a replacement cost model. So there are inefficiencies in that book cost of techniques, and also routing wasn't as efficient. They made decisions to go here, 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 where if you optimally routed today, that would not be the case. So the historic cost of a hybrid fiber coax network is going to be less than the replacement cost of a hybrid fiber coax network, because in the replacement cost model, you would do it to today's standard, which is more efficient, more advanced than these companies and their predecessors when they started building those things, and they borrowed money from a bank, in those days, and they started stringing wire, and it cost as much as they could borrow from the bank. Just like when somebody builds an office building, that costs more than replacement costs today. Same circumstance.
Okay, but what we're talking about is the value of the coax that was laid, right?
Yes.
I mean, we're not talking about the other part of it. And so if we're talking
exactly
about
the point.
the historical cost
Sure.
of that coax that was laid, how is that so much different than the appropriate RCN? And that, I'm just going to let it go because it's kind of my rhetorical question.
No, I think it's a good question, and I think that is the confusion, and because we come in there as technicians, if you will, to say that really here's the most economic way to do it, and it's fiber to the prem, looks nothing like what it looks like today, and that's like, I'm not with you. I'm trying to value this system that's there today, right? So how does that mean anything? But if you kind of set that aside and just simply look at, if I were to rebuild this system today with kind of the same mix of fiber and coax that's out there in the system today, that's kind of somewhat of a reproduction cost almost, right? I'm trying to reproduce what's out there. Maybe I'm taking into account some new technology for the head ends or taking into account new technology for the customer prem equipment, but generally I'm trying to replace the functionality that sits out today. That's dramatically less than what's on the books. Why is it dramatically less? Jeff indicated that there are different techniques, different approaches, more advanced ways of, more optimal ways of deploying a network today. But then too, there is a second layer that is what's called ghost assets. So these are just assets that are retired in place. So a lot of the fiber or a lot of the coax that's out there is not retired off of books in a cable company because it's held for future use. And what is held for future use? So we can power the amplifier. So because we power the amplifier, we leave it on the books. Well, the functionality of what's actually happening is not its original intent. And so that's why there's this excess cost on the books that does not have the economic value if you were to look at it in terms of replacement cost.
I do want to make one more comment, and that is that in reality, most of that stuff is so far out, and we have a low floor on it anyway that it doesn't represent a huge value. I'm just saying that.
Often that is the case. No, that's true. It depends on the jurisdiction, but and that's a good way to recognize it. That's why I brought up the residual, and one way to recognize that is what the floor is and where you put it, and that's a good technique. No, thank you.
And Jeff, I mean,
Yes.
just depending on the jurisdiction, you could have a residual of 10%.
Yep,
Or you could have one like in Indiana of 30%.
that's right.
So
It does vary. I mean, we've seen jurisdictions, and your model may do that, by what they do with their floor and residual fully account for this functional obsolescence. We're not saying everybody doesn't. In fact, that's a lot of the discussion, and that's a way to do it in many systems, and it works. I think the industry's saying, okay, we want to give you information, and if that's the way you do it, and that back end of the curve, that you're right, it's really far out, and you probably do this. A lot of jurisdictions take everything to 1% or something, before a certain year, and if you put that at the right place, industry would say that works, or 3% or whatever. So I know we're about 12:15, so any more questions quickly, John?
Just really quick, I just want to hear Carl's thoughts on this. When you're looking at and there's Jim, so he can maybe help this too. When you're looking at the two networks and you're looking at that theoretical replacement cost network, fiber to the prem, do you give any consideration to the lost revenue that would incur if you actually were going to build that plant? Because you can't just flip a switch and have a working, brand-new network in the ground producing revenue tomorrow.
Sure.
It's going to take a year or two or whatever, how
Sure.
long. Does that come into play in this calculation? Because we are calculating the opposite side
Sure.
the lost revenue because of inefficiencies and repairs and all those sort of things. What about that flip side, that time cost?
Sure, that makes sense. And so, yes, the answer to your question, there is an element of interest during construction, which is basically, hey, I'm going to borrow the money. I'm not going to have any kind of revenue during that time in which I'm building the plant. And so I'm going to accrue interest, which is a quasi kind of return on that plant. That's accumulated into the replacement cost new. So that interest during construction is added to the replacement cost new.
But are you calculating your return on investment starting 2 years out or on day one?
I don't know the exact time period, but it is assumed that under normal construction periods, what does it take and how would interest accrue over those normal construction periods? And we're mimicking existing construction periods in other experiences that
But I'm not talking about the interest, I'm talking about the revenue that would be generated if you bought the old plant.
well, if you think about it, what revenue is not your end game, right? Your end game is profitability, right? So, or return on that investment. So to superimpose what a return on that investment is, that's what interest during construction is. That's a return on that investment, right? So that does accumulate into the replacement cost new.
Yep. Thank you. Everyone, panel, thank you very much.